for me, we're an early stage investor, and very often, that investment, for us, we do lots of them, but for the other party might be literally their first time ever fundraising and might even be their first time ever negotiating anything, which means it's also for us a teachable moment. So it's this funny thing of how do we have an investment outcome or negotiation outcome that we're happy with, and how do we also use this chance to help the other person grow and learn from it, and which can take many different. Sometimes it's the other person might be asking for too much, and we have to have a conversation, kind of like the one you're describing. I've had many of those. We've also had the opposite, where they're not asking for enough.
Oh, and interesting. Yeah.
That's the even more weird, because it's not in our interests to tell them to ask for more.
Yeah.
But in a weird way, it is, because we want to give the other person the courage to do that on the next round and the round after that. So we're very much thinking, as you mentioned, a VC investment, especially pre-seed investment, is just the beginning of a 5 to 10 year journey, and winning or losing whatever on that particular deal is not as important as making sure the next 10 years are going to be great.
Hi, I'm excited for you to listen to today's episode. I get to talk with a longtime investor of Athena, who is just an incredible person, recruiter. It's Ollie Partovi. He was an early investor in basically every hot tech company you've ever heard of, from Uber to Airbnb to Facebook. He founded Code.org to encourage people to learn coding, and is now the CEO of Neo, a venture capital as well as accelerator program for the best technical talent. And we have an amazing conversation that ends with a story you just have to hear for yourself. But he talks about the biggest mistake he ever made, selling to Steve Jobs, and from that, what he has learned. And while I've got you, let me just do a quick plug for Athena, the company that I co-founded. Athena provides compliance training as well as a host of other tools that your company probably needs. Please do check Athena out. Ollie, I'm so happy to have you here. I have known you as Athena's sort of earliest investor, but Anne, my co-founder, has known you long before that as a mentor and a sort of collector of really smart technical talent through Neo. So I'll give a very quick intro, but this is funny because I've known you for a long time, and my intro is much more personal. But I think the impressive background that you have is angel investor in a million of the hottest tech companies, from Facebook, Uber, all of that. Yourself a founder, having started a successful tech company, and then maybe another founder in making both Code.org with your twin brother, as I got that right, and then Neo, an organization that, as I see it, is both a venture capital fund, but is also an accelerator and kind of a community builder for just the best technical talent, encouraging them, as I've heard you say it, to take risks instead of just join a company. What did I miss?
That was really great. We like to call Neo a mentorship community, and our business model is VC investing, but our North Star is about mentoring people and bringing people together. We've had an amazing past year. Several of our bets from long ago are all kind of paying off at the same time. The notable names are Cursor, Kalshi, and Blue Sky are all companies we invested in from the first round, and have all at the same time started becoming really high profile. So so we're crushing it. Very happy to be here.
I'm definitely will want to talk with you about how you kind of spot talent and how you bring them on, because I think that's your superpower. But maybe to start, right before we were recording, I reminded you of a story that was very meaningful to me. So I'll just kind of quickly tell it, and then would love to get kind of your perspective on this. So Melanie and I were recording one of our podcasts talking about how Athena now has a no negotiations policy. We do first and best offer for candidates for a bunch of reasons, but to include that it's nice that you don't have that adversarial moment before you become partners, right? So it's kind of yucky if you join kind of wondering oh, should I have asked for 5K more? And also man, Ollie was kind of a jerk in the negotiation policy process, but now I've got to be, work for him, it just feels yucky. And I was telling Melanie that I remember you taught me and Anne, my co-founder, a really valuable lesson early on. So we were, and I think you were leading our pre-seed round, and essentially we had largely agreed on price, it's handshake, and Anne and I, for whatever reason, probably the reason a lot of candidates negotiate is because we felt like we don't want to be suckers and like not ask for sort of everything. And probably also because we're women. And so we thought like, oh no, maybe we're accidentally being overly cautious and we need to be even, overcompensate. Whatever the reason was, we kind of came back and we said, how about, I think it was like 1 million more or something. And you very kindly got us on a call and explained that this wasn't the best move because one, we felt like we were relitigating something, and that doesn't feel good when it feels like an issue has been closed and it's opened back up. And two, because you said something to the effect of negotiations are great when both people walk away feeling like they got a lot of what they wanted, versus walking right up to the line between you're both technically satisfied with this, but Anne and I are much more happy than you are. Like that's not a great way to start a partnership. And I thought that was such good advice. So I'd love to hear your perspective. Like, have you had to tell a lot of founders that? Yeah, maybe start there.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because for me, we're an early stage investor, and very often, that investment for us, we do lots of them, but for the other party might be literally their first time ever fundraising and might even be their first time ever negotiating anything, which means it's also for us a teachable moment. So it's this funny thing of how do we have an investment outcome or negotiation outcome that we're happy with, and how do we also use this chance to like help the other person grow and learn from it, uh, and you know, which can take many different. Sometimes it's the other person might be asking for too much and we have to have a conversation kind of like the one you're describing. I've had many of those. We've also had the opposite where they're not asking for enough and
Oh,
we're like,
interesting. Yeah.
that's the even more weird because it's like not in our interests to
Right.
tell them to ask for more,
Yeah.
but in a weird way it is because we want to give the other person like the courage to do that on the next round and the round after that. So we're very much thinking, like as you mentioned, like a VC investment, especially pre-seed investment, is just the beginning of a 5 to 10 year journey. And winning or losing the whatever on that particular deal is not as important as making sure the next 10 years are going to be great. So yeah, so with you, kind of, I think the essentially the lesson was a little bit like, look, getting the absolute max out of this one-time negotiation may not be worth it if it leaves the other party having a bad taste in their mouth, because for the next 5 or 10 years they'll not be as excited you know to go to bat every time or so on. And it's just better if the mutual goal is to get to a fair deal, get to fair market value, or fair, a deal that where no side is a sucker, no side is being taken advantage of, and that's a win-win rather than a win-lose.
But I feel like something that like you're mentioning here, and I've definitely noticed, is like you just kind of play the long game, like even longer than Athena. I would guess that like you spot talent early and you cultivate and you a relationship that's meaningful such that 25 years down the road, like Anne will think of you. And I think that like weirdly what you're saying here kind of connects to some things I've learned building a company with how you treat employees. Like it's a maybe a weird example, but mat leave. Like I think a lot of our parental leave, I think a lot of companies kind of take a little bit of this like, well, in the short term, this sucks because I like lose somebody for a quarter. And it's like, well, yeah, that does suck. But I think like the amount of sort of loyalty you can engender by like treating somebody well in a way that like maybe is sort of against your like short term immediate gain is like really palpable, but doesn't always show up in a spreadsheet.
Just helping the other person, giving more than you receive, doesn't mean you're losing it. I'd say it's a long term, some in one way or another with karma, things will come back. And also it's just a nicer way to live.
I
I
agree.
just generally think I'd much rather justify doing things that feel right, and even if they're not in my short-term interests, I feel quite confident that they will be in my long-term interests. And this applies to much more than just a negotiation like that. You mentioned hiring. Almost every person that I hire, I'll really take a time to understand like what are they seeking,
Mm.
and if they're interested in other options, I'll literally try to help their other options also. Like Emily, who's now my partner and has been with Neo for several years, when she was considering joining us, you know, I asked, and she said, well, I would also consider trying to be a chief of staff at a Series B firm with like a social impact, maybe climate impact. And I was like, all right, let me find three of those and introduce you to the CEOs with
Yeah.
a recommendation. Like literally, I'll help you find your best alternative option. And then I'll still try to get you to choose us. And sometimes you might lose somebody by doing that. But if they join you, they'll have a deeper loyalty of like of knowing that there's a real, like I actually care for her welfare and her well-being. And even if I had lost her, or there are other candidates where I might have lost by doing that, they will refer their friends, or they will go out there authentically speaking, so highly of the experience. And it might not have been the best fit, if a few calls would have caused them to go a different direction, it may not even be that big a loss.
I had an incorrect perception of when I was starting Athena, because I didn't come up through a sales organization, never really even worked with a sales organization, is I thought sales was kind of what we're both like, maybe the idea that we're both talking against, of like, I'm going to drive a hard bargain and like, I'm going to be super aggressive and I'm going to get everything I want. And I've learned, maybe I'm doing it wrong, unclear, but my experience has been like very similar to sales, where if you like, we've had prospects who, for whatever reason, they're like, look, I really want to do this, but like in the next 2 weeks I can't because I've got something else going on. And I've heard advice sometimes to be like, no, drive, they work on your timeline. And instead giving a little bit of grace in those instances has resulted in customers who've been super loyal to us, who referred other customers. Like, I don't know, I've just been surprised that being thoughtful and nice in sales can work. Like it doesn't, you don't have to have this, what to me is a very old school, like used car salesman kind of vibe of like, just like all aggression and no thoughtfulness or consultation.
Yeah, and especially if what you're selling is a, long-term, subscription or so on, winning in the short term might cause the other party to, you know, like have a bad taste, and they want to like take it out on you on the renewal, or, like to reset the bar or so on. And whereas if it's the opposite, if you let them win a little bit, same thing, they'll reciprocate by finding other ways to help you out in return.
I think it's really cool, and maybe a good segue into how you recruit and kind of identify talent. So something I noticed, I went to the retreat a couple of years ago, and this is where you like bring together, the Neo community, both scholars, investments, etc., like
The
friends,
Neo
mentors,
reunion.
Neo
Yes.
reunion, excuse me. And it's lovely. But something I noticed, like just to be blunt, is kind of like when I walked into the room, it's like this doesn't look like a lot of places in tech that I'm at. Like it looked more diverse in a bunch of different ways, to include like as a company, Ann and I are both women founders, and that's quite rare in tech. Like there was just a lot of women, and especially for an organization that focuses on technical talent, like that's not always what I see, or even at this point, kind of my stereotype. And so I'd love to know, to the extent you think things are working, like what is working? How are you able to do something that candidly a lot of tech will kind of hand wring and say like pipeline problem, not our problem, whatever.
About diversity, first of all, there is a pipeline problem, but I
Yeah.
would say that is our problem. So,
That might be the biggest distinction, is what you just said. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say a lot of these arguments are like both sides are correct. Let's agree with each other and kind of work on both things. There is absolutely, when we say pipeline problem, there are not enough women and underrepresented minorities. When I say enough, the number of women and underrepresented minorities in the tech industry are fewer than the general population. It's about
Sure.
20% female when the general population is about 50%. If you look at college computer science, the same thing, 20% female. How come it's not 50%? If you look at high school computer science, it's also 20% female. Why not 50%? And, and the solutions for the tech industry to say we're going to be 50%, without thinking about that isn't fair, to be honest. Like it's
I think that's a fair point, that it's like you can't ignore the constraints of of reality like that, I think is super
Exactly.
fair.
And
Yeah.
if one company manages to get to 50% female, that just means some other company is going below 20%, right? This,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
uh, so, um, uh, yeah, so I co-founded code.org, which brings computer science to middle school and elementary school and high school. Um, you know, something like 100 million children worldwide are learning to code, sometimes as early as kindergarten. And the gender differences really start around puberty. And it's, like it's in seventh and eighth grade or so that girls start feeling, for whatever reason, maybe I'm not as good at advanced math or coding or so on. And whereas in third grade, like, frankly, oftentimes girls are ahead of boys in those
Mhm.
subjects. So introducing computer science, the younger you can introduce it, the more you can get all people to feel confident and excited about it. And whether they're female or black or any underrepresented minority, to overcome that kind of self-imposed lack of confidence, and then to hopefully crush it in high school, college, and eventually in the tech industry. The other thing we do at Neo specifically, though, is we place a huge amount of value on role models, and it's not a coincidence that we had you speak on stage at the Neo reunion. It's unbelievable how impactful it is, Roxanne, to just see one person who looks like you who's succeeding.
Yeah.
And if you're a white male or an Asian male, you may not realize that because there's so many of them. So
Yeah.
there's no shortage or of Indian men. Both Satya Nadella, CEOs of
Yeah.
Microsoft and Google are both Indian men. Whereas if you are, in whatever way, underrepresented, if you're an immigrant from Lebanon or woman or black person or so on, seeing one person who looks like you and realizing they're just like me, they're human, they're not some kind of, magical supernatural superpower being. They're just like me, and they worked hard and they got to where they are, um, is enough to make somebody feel I can do that too. And so we pay a lot of attention and go through a lot of effort to surface role models that are diverse. Uh, Similarly, our website has photos and videos and so on, and our mentors are, intentionally chosen to be a diverse representation. And by the way, I don't want to limit this just to, gender or ethnicity.
Yeah.
It's also important to have people with different ideas or coming from different backgrounds. When I started Neo, the easy path would have been to like find people from Facebook, Dropbox, like the companies I had invested in or
The
that I
sort of
was,
sure thing
yeah, and be
kids.
like,
Yeah.
hey,
Yeah.
all the smartest guys from Dropbox or from, a few companies or people from Harvard, basically the circles that I was already in where people trusted me. That would have been the much easier path. But I was really intentional about saying, I also got to get some people from companies I'm not as close to, like Apple or Stripe or so on, and have representation that feels more like a cross section of Silicon Valley. And in the same vein, try to get to an equal number of women, uh, uh, and also age.
Yeah.
I was in my 40s when I started Neo. I really wanted to make sure it wasn't just 40-year-olds and college students, but also kind of all the different generations in between and older than me. And so it really shows when you go to a Neo event, this
Yeah.
feeling everybody is happier, frankly. No one likes to be in a homogenous group. It's
Right.
more pleasant for everyone to meet someone who's different from you, whether they're younger or different in some way, and then find the common ground and
Yeah.
realize, we're also the same.
I agree. And I guess like maybe a question to like click in a little deeper to it though is like, do you kind of train yourself, your team to focus on certain inputs? Like when you're interviewing, like, do you have really structured interviews to combat bias? Or are you looking at outputs? So, example being like, okay, we've just admitted the latest class of neo scholars and we did an analysis and turns out, we're sort of only picking from these two schools, or I'm just making it up, these two geographies or something. And, we're lacking representation in X or Y. Like, do you tend to think one is more important than the other? Inputs, like what you're doing, or outputs, like what does the cohort look like?
We focus on, we try to make the top of funnel diverse, which maybe, I guess that's inputs, meaning um, we we want everyone to be meeting the same bar,
Yeah.
and our selection process is completely merit based. I should say, trying as hard as possible to have a pure meritocracy. What we do though is put extra effort to speaking to women in computer science groups, or groups like Color Stack, which is people of color in computer science, to try to make sure that they don't self select out. We want to try to get more women to apply, more Black people or brown people to apply, or so on, to uh, to have a diverse top of funnel, and or even overrepresentation of women or Black people at the top of the funnel, while then holding them to the same standards as everybody else.
Yeah.
And there might be cases where if if someone's right on the borderline and we can't decide, oh my gosh, should they get the second interview or not, maybe we'll be a little bit more, like, give them more of a second chance for someone who's from an underrepresented group.
Yeah.
But I would say never would we do that for like the final selection. We, you know, and by the way, I, I know some of the strongest women or Black people in tech. They would be incredibly offended at the idea of anybody lowering the bar for them, and frankly, they wouldn't want to be part of an organization that even dreamt of that. The strongest women founders want to raise money from a VC that funds the strongest startups, period, right? And so that's what we aim to be. Uh, I will say though that there's this, when I said we are trying to run a purely merit-based process, I think there's a kind of popular fallacy that merit and diversity are somehow mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's like social media likes to create this like war between DEI and now MEI, which is Alex Wang had this post saying we're about merit, excellence, and intelligence, I think. But it was obviously try to strike back at DEI. But Alex, in that post, he said something which I 100% agree with, and I retweeted it. He said merit and diversity are not mutually exclusive, and I think he said like no group has a monopoly on merit. What I through the way I believe it really is and ought to be is that the people who care about diversity are trying to pursue diversity without sacrificing merit, and the people who care about merit are trying to pursue merit without sacrificing diversity. And that's just hard. It's hard for anyone to do, to have both, but it is the goal you should strive for. And and I feel like we've been pretty successful at it. But at least more importantly, I'd rather dispel this feeling that somehow you can only do one and you have to choose which your priority is.
Maybe a fun place to end would be, I love, when I was still on Twitter, I really loved you'd have these tweets about like biggest F ups that you had. And the one that I remember was the Steve Jobs, selling to Steve Jobs, I know I'm worth X. I'm sure I'm butchering it. One, do you have a favorite F up of yours? Like, is there one that you think is like the sort of best oops you've got?
Favorite is a weird word. I mean, that Steve Jobs story is the biggest one. It's still my pinned tweet. So
Yeah.
and is the most viral thing I've ever posted on social media. So favorite's not the right word though. I would say that story. First of all, I posted it a few years ago, but I held it like secretly for like 12 or 13 years before posting it. And so, I mean, that interaction occurred in 2000, I want to say 2008.
And
Um,
can you give a quick summary for folks? I'll be sure to link
yeah,
to the tweet,
I
but
was I was CEO of my second startup. Thank goodness my first startup was very successful. So this was my second startup, and it was a tough position, Roxanne. I was because inherently my startup was not doing that well. And being the CEO of a startup that's struggling is inherently a position of some moral hazard because the job
yeah,
of the CEO is to show to the world how awesome your company is. And when your
totally.
company is not awesome, you're like, how do I do this?
That's not a great
And
spin, or you have to find
yeah,
a good spin because yeah,
and we were in the this was summer 2008, unbeknownst to me, just before the global financial crisis. But it was kind of, the warning signs were there, and we were hoping to sell the company. But part of it, you don't sell the company by waving a flag saying this is for sale. You hope that someone will pursue you. And I had spent almost a year building relationships at Apple. This was the company that we thought was the best fit for us. Our name was I Like with a little I, kind of almost named to be
sure.
suited to
A
be a
little
part of
wink
the
at them, yeah.
Apple
Yeah.
portfolio company. Essentially, we loved Apple. We worshipped, Steve Jobs from afar. And after a year, we were invited to a meeting to pitch him, ostensibly to sell the company. My co-founders and I were so psyched, and the first 30 or 40 minutes of the meeting were so wonderful. I remember it still, like the sun was shining, the demo, everything went well, and it culminated with Steve saying, I like you guys. You guys would fit in here at Apple. We want to buy the company. And I'll let Eddie Q, my lieutenant, take the negotiation from here. And the first mistake, I'm such an idiot. I should have just said, thank you, Steve, goodbye, and continue with Eddie, who was at this point, somebody I trusted, and he was essentially the champion of the deal. It would have been much better to work with Eddie. But thinking that I'm the CEO, this is my chance to add value. I said, hold on a second, Steve. Can you just share a little bit about what ballpark are you thinking? And he said, what was the last valuation that you raised money at? And I said, well, $50 million, but that was 2 years ago before we had really launched. We have, millions of users now and so on. And he said, okay, we would acquire the company for $50 million. And I was like, did he hear right? That's like no premium for 2 years of work. And my heart was sinking. And I was just thinking, like, what can I do to make this number go up? And so I said, Steve, I think we're worth 3 times that. And then my posture changed. And this is the second big mistake. I changed my tone a bit. And I was like, actually, Steve, I know we're worth 3 times that. And he pounced on this. And he said, did you just say, I know? Are you implying that you have some alternative offer? Bullshit. You're full of shit.
Mm.
And he had totally seen through me. I was trying to trick him into thinking we had an alternative offer.
Yeah.
And this switch from saying I think, which was kind of weaker but safer, to I
Yeah.
know, that was intention. Like I was intending to mislead him, and he kind of eviscerated me. I actually don't remember what happened next. I just remember my co-founders berating me on the drive home. But the deal fell through. But the harder lesson, Roxanne, is it made me really think about, like him calling me out for lying didn't feel good, but it made me realize I'm probably crossing this line more often than I'd like to admit in other
Mm.
interactions,
Yeah.
and that other people are probably also detecting it, but just not telling it to my face.
Yeah.
And that is what really made me feel, just ashamed and not proud of, like, how I was trying to conduct myself as a CEO, and to really rethink, like, I've got to find some other way to show strength and optimism without crossing that line. And so, yeah, the way Steve did it was definitely unnecessarily cruel, but I would still say I was very grateful to him for calling me out in a way that I'd say most other people would just kind of like not say anything, but perhaps judge behind my back that they thought I was being untruthful.
Well, I'm very grateful that you kind of, after years of marinating on that story, I would imagine why right after on the drive home you wouldn't necessarily want to start to share that with the world, because I think the oopses that hurt the most are ones that you want to like let have some time to heal over. But I think it's really powerful to share mistakes, because especially when someone's as successful as you are, it's easy from the outside to sort of think like, oh, Ollie's never made a oops, like it's to your earlier point on representation, like it's really helpful, to be like, smart, successful people make oopses.
I've made many, and I hope that you make many too. Not big, obviously. I don't
Don't
think
worry,
failure
one
is.
step ahead of you there.
It's that if you're not trying, if you never make an oops, if you never fail, it means you're not maximizing your potential. You're not putting yourself outside your comfort zone enough. Um, that being said, I'd say my biggest mistakes often come from times when I had a scarcity mentality. That example was definitely an example of that. And I'd say my best decisions are when I had an abundance mentality. Like when you feel confident that everything's going to work out fine. And this goes back to how we started the conversation talking about in a negotiation or recruiting a candidate. If you deeply feel and know that the future is going to be fine, that's when you're usually your best self. And so, you know, so that's what I've tried to. That's a lesson I've learned in recent years, and I've tried to apply to these difficult encounters when I can.
I think it's a perfect place to end, and I totally agree that I read some essay like fear is a bad driver or something like that. But it's very much feels the same thing, where if you can have that confidence, that's usually catching even to yourself, like smiling in the mirror before a meeting, kind of a thing. And then it's also very contagious to those around you. And so I think it's a good note to end on. It's very optimistic.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful being here, Roxanne, and can't wait to hang out with you in person again soon.
It'll be really fun. Thanks so much, Ollie. I've been waiting my whole life to say this. If you liked this episode, please like, subscribe, and follow us on LinkedIn, because that's the only social media platform where we hang out.